Thanks, Doug. All right. Okay. All right, folks, so if it helps any, some of you can try and navigate your way in. There's still plenty of room. I mean, this can be much more uncomfortable than it is right now. So we can do that. You can also come through this way and come around here. We've got an elite group over here you can muscle in on, but whatever you do, but by all means come in and be as comfortable as you can possibly be. This is where we typically have had the Mises Circle events. So it'd be right here in the conservatory. Because the idea is that this is more informal than the rest of the day. So we sort of feel like it won't seem as informal if you're in the same room you've been sitting in all day long. So this way, it's more informal. You're sitting cross-legged, you're getting a cramp, and you're thinking, man, I like it. Yeah! So, all right. So this will be super fun. We haven't had a Mises Circle in this room for at least 2 or 3 Mises U's. So I think we've finally moved past the fatal accident. So we're moving forward. It's a new day. We've got glass now. We learn. We got glass panels up there. All right. Well, I'm going to be talking a little bit about things I've been up to recently and how they relate to all this. But as Doug said, I actually went to Mises University in 1993 and in 94. And we didn't have any cash prizes that you could win. We didn't have any exam. You just went to Mises U and you liked it. But we did have Murray Rothbard there. And I remember even then, the faculty would be introduced as they were the other night, in alphabetical order, but except for Rothbard, who was introduced at the end. And when he was introduced, well, just everybody goes berserk, people are crazy, cheering, standing up, and just wonderful. And he delivered the opening lecture. And what a great experience this is. And any of you who are Facebook friends of mine, in my college photo album, I have a picture of me with Murray Rothbard. So eat your hearts out, baby. As a matter of fact, we got this fancy schmancy Man, Economy, and State with Power and Market Scholars Edition. But I don't care. I'm sticking with my paper-thin book cover 1993 yellow edition that says, "To Tom Woods, for Man and Economy and Against the State. Best regards, Murray Rothbard." Not giving that up for anything. So, super fun. And then even better was, I got to see Rothbard at another event before the following Mises U in 94, and then we'd corresponded a little bit. So by the time 1994 comes along, Mises U, opening night, students are sort of introducing themselves to each other. Rothbard walks in, and I was also going to Columbia, which was where he got his PhD, so that sort of helped. Walks in, comes right up to me and says, "Oh, hi, Tom." And I thought, oh, this is just too good, baby. Come on. Anyway, such a generous man, a good, decent, generous man. And everybody here at the Mises Institute, I feel that way about that. They're not only are they smart, I mean, not only are you dealing with just shocking geniuses here, and in fact, let me just stop right there and deal with the genius aspect. David Gordon, okay? I want you to just think of some topic in philosophy, as obscure as you can make it, some historical subject, whatever, and just go up and ask David about it. And see what he tells you, and you're going to have to tell him to shut up politely. Like, how does he know? I'll never forget. It was at Mises U 1993, and there was a dispute about something Kant had said, and in fact, Hans was trying to justify something he had said with reference to Kant. David cites the exact paragraph where you can find it, and Hans says, "Yes, that is the passage I had in mind." Yes. I mean, the guy. This is why Ralph Rako says, "Who needs the Library of Congress when you have David Gordon?" I mean, he's an amazing resource. Or Guido Holzman. Now, I don't see him in here, so he can't stop me at this point from embarrassing him. But Guido, when he had a chance to meet Murray Rothbard once probably around 1994, and the one time they met, Guido had. Oh, is he up there? I'm telling the story. So you can't do anything about it now? Anyway, the one time they met, Guido was just learning English. So he's he's trying his best to communicate with Rothbard, who's trying to understand him because he knows that, Guido's a genius. And now, of course, Guido gives the opening lecture at Mises U with this beautiful, elegant English, using words like octogenarian. These aren't normal people. Or I'll just give you just one more example. I could keep going, but I'll just give an example of the guy who would be most embarrassed by my singling him out would be Jeff Herbener up here. Now, Jeff Herbener is he's already shaking his head at me. He's the chairman of the economics department at Grove City College. And Jeff, has a very calm manner to him, and you never have you don't really get the sense until you sit him down and talk to him that whatever fallacy it is you're having trouble refuting, if that fallacy were a person, he could rip its head off while still eating his meal. I call him up all the time. I say, all right, Jeff, I need some tutoring on this, and this. And it takes him like 10 seconds with each one. And I think, how did I not know that? So, you've got this great opportunity this week to sit down and talk to these guys. And I'm telling you, it's going to be extremely rewarding. It was for me. After I got out of Mises U, I started reading this tradition all this time, and it did change the course of my life. That's not an exaggeration. It's definitely absolutely the case. All right. Anyway, I'll get more to the point. I didn't come up with the title for the presentation tonight, but I guess the idea of it is that I was going to say a little bit just about my book Meltdown, but particularly just a little something about books and writing and the marketing experience I've had and things of that nature. Because I think at this point, people in this room more or less understand Austrian business cycle theory, more or less, which is not something I can normally take for granted. Some of you may have seen, by the way, probably the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me was last September, Ron Paul had this rally for the Republic in Minneapolis, and I was one of the speakers. And I sort of wrote up a little outline of what I was going to say in advance. And, as with Bob Murphy, you think of these lines, you think, all right, they're going to go for this one. This one's just red meat. This is a big applause line. And others you think are just descriptive lines. Well, I had one line in which I said, just that it's interesting and encouraging that more and more financial analysts are becoming interested in something called Austrian business cycle theory. And everybody cheered. Like I had to stop. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the Target Center all cheering for Austrian business cycle theory. How is this even remotely possible? It's like I woke up in the Bizarro world or something. I can't get over it. Anyway, so let me first, so some of you may know that I wrote this book called Meltdown that came out in February. And the idea of it was to apply Austrian insights to what's going on right now. And of course, my thinking behind it was, if we don't have a book that applies Austrian insights, what instead we're going to get is very predictable, animal spirits have just gone berserk or whatever. Greedy people just suddenly became super duper greedy. Like whatever, or there isn't enough regulation. Totally predictable, utterly predictable sorts of theses being put forth. And I thought, no, let's shake things up a little bit. And in particular, I liked the idea of trying to be one of the first, if not the first, out of the box on this subject. And I actually think, although there was a little book on the initial congressional bailout that came out, and there were a couple books on the mortgage market, I actually think Meltdown is the first one that also deals with the bailouts. Because there's stuff that actually it even mentions in December 2008, there was a news item about they were going to target the federal funds rate somewhere around 0.25% down to 0. And I was able to get that in there, and the book came out February 9th. So it was thanks to my publisher, Regnery Publishing. They were super cooperative. We were able to get this thing out really quickly so that the information was fresh. Well, my initial idea for this book was I actually didn't think I should write it. I'm still just a student of the Austrian school in my opinion. So I thought, really, Ron Paul ought to write a book on the economic crisis, right? because he's got the name recognition, the credibility. He's been trying to tell us this. Nobody's been listening. Now, man, if he wrote this, because if I write it, I'm some kid, who cares? But if he writes it, people will pay attention, they'll listen. So, I managed to convey this idea, and he was not really, his view was, look, I think his view is, what the heck else can I do at this point? You know, like I'm flying all over the country, I'm giving speeches, I'm trying to be a congressman on top of all this, and I think his view was, I've already written everything I could say on the economy, like what more could I do? And my argument was, that's what makes it so easy, just put all these things together. Like, how do you think most books get put together? Not people sit down, I'll just write this all from scratch. No, you scrounge around thinking, what about that article I wrote for the Freeman in 1999? Isn't that slightly related? I'll pull that in, and before you know it, you have a book. But, he just wasn't interested, so I said, well, but if I wrote it, maybe you might consider writing the foreword? And so I think I sort of guilted him into that. So I did get that. And now it turns out he's got this book on the Fed coming out. So I guess it worked out. Now we get 2 books for the price of 1. Now, sometimes people think, now this book did very well, New York Times bestseller, and it was on there, including the extended list for 10 weeks. People have an exaggerated understanding of how many copies of a bestseller actually, would constitute a bestseller. So that is to say, unless you're actually involved in book publishing or you're an author yourself, you tend to have, because I used to, before I was doing this, you have a very exaggerated sense of how many copies of a typical title will sell. Well, a typical nonfiction title sells about 3,000 copies, round about there. So, most people think, if you write a book, automatically you sell 50,000 copies. No, you don't. And part of the reason is that as of a few years ago, the most recent statistic I'm familiar with is that in 2004 or 5, there were 195,000 new books published that year alone. Now, how can you, and that's 70% increase from 10 years earlier. Well, how can you possibly compete? How can your book possibly stand out? So it's very, very difficult. In fact, my publisher says books are some of the hardest things in the world to sell. The editor at Houghton Mifflin said a few years ago that they released 3,000 books a few years ago, 3,000 separate titles. And the number of those titles that sold more than 2,000 copies was 200. So most books bomb completely. And I'm not saying this to say, look at how super I am, because I've had some bombs. I'm part of that. Because I've written scholarly books, and we all know you write scholarly books for the inner rewards they bring you, and but rather just to show that we need to lower our estimation. So people think, you must have sold 1 million copies. No, not even almost nobody ever sells 1 million copies, or 500,000, or even 100,000. My politically incorrect guide to American history has probably sold about 170,000. Which, again, a nonfiction author would say, this is just the most astonishing number ever. But I think given the notoriety it has, people think I must have sold millions of copies. So that now, if I take people out for dinner, I think some of them are inclined not to even say thank you, because they figure, well, you're loaded, right? You're... I don't even know why I should even acknowledge the dinner. So, I'm not poor, but my point is, So Meltdown is probably still just in the tens of thousands at this point, but we're hoping it will have legs and be a backlist title that will persist into the future. Now, of course, the real benefit of this book was the obvious news hook, because if you want to sell a book when there are 195,000 new titles coming out every year, you need some media behind you. And how are you going to get into the media? Unless you already have your own talk show, you're on television or on the radio, how are you going to get in the media? You have to have some news hook, because typically, especially in the last few years, TV hosts are not so interested in having you on just because you have a book out. Oh, great. Well, let's clear our schedules for you. No, they want the book to have something sort of remotely related to the news, to what they're talking about. So this, I didn't even have to stretch it. Previous books I've had to say, well, this is Thomas Jefferson kind of would have had something to say about bailouts or whatever. Like, it's just a real stretch. But this, clearly, right? You could get media from it. So the news hook is key. Of course, the politically incorrect guy did very well, had no news hook whatsoever. I think the title is just so clever. Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. It's a clever title. I didn't come up with it. The publisher did. And then they commissioned me to write it. But that's the exception. I think unless you're like Doris Kearns Goodwin, and for some reason all the drones know they're supposed to buy her books as soon as they come out, it's very hard to get a history book to just go right off the shelf, Because when the establishment isn't shilling for you one way or another. So this way I was able to do some media. But the trick is that if you're not living in New York or some of the major centers, it's harder to get on TV because they want you in studio, preferably, rather than via satellite. So in fact, about a month ago, I got a call from Glenn Beck's show saying they want, which I've been on a few times, but saying, Glenn wants to have you on. He loves your book, and he really does like the book. I mean, he promotes it on his reading list, and his producers have told me that he just doesn't shut up about it. So that's great. I wish he'd say more of this on the air, but I'm happy. But so I got this call saying, we want to have you on the show, and I thought, oh, great. So I emailed my wife, hey, I'm going to be on Glenn Beck today. Then I get this call back saying, nah, we just want to have in-studio people. You're killing me. So I'd rearrange my whole schedule. Gee, how am I going to get there? It takes an hour, whatever. So likewise, Bloomberg, the financial network, they were all set to have me on. They said, oh, you can't get to New York, huh? You coming to New York soon? Well, actually, no. Well, let us know when you get here. So, all right, that's fair enough. But believe me, the negatives associated with living in New York so outweigh this problem that I wouldn't even consider that. But I've actually, as I say, I actually managed to do pretty well. But this is a quotation I'm going to read to you, just one sentence, from the editor of The Nation magazine. This is why I wrote the book. Because this was becoming, and unfortunately perhaps still is, the conventional wisdom. Advocates of the free market must confront the fact that both the Great Depression and the current financial chaos were preceded by years of laissez-faire economic policies. But, I mean, they think this is so obvious they don't even need to defend this statement, right? I mean, this is just obvious. So that needs to be refuted and smashed. So, I'm sure people, have an understanding of Austrian business cycle theory. The idea is to apply it to the current situation. And one of the points the book makes is that, and I think Bob made this point the other day, is that when Greenspan helped to give us the so-called soft landing during the dot-com bust, so 2000, but particularly going into 2001, we got 11 rate cuts in 2001. Everybody thought this is wonderful. Look, we had only a very minor recession and all the rest of it. But my contention in the book is that this actually made the current situation all the worse. Because instead of a full correction, and correction is such a beautiful word here, instead the economy was persisting in unsustainable directions all the longer, all that while, until this bust we got. So if we'd had a full correction, we wouldn't have been making these erroneous decisions all this time. It wouldn't have been as severe. So the very things that are pointed to as virtues on Greenspan's part are in fact vices. And yet, we now find out, I don't know why it took us this long, but now recently, a few weeks ago, some of you may have seen that a lot of quotations from Paul Krugman around 2001, 2002 have been dug out. And the best known one is the one, the controversial one about calling for a housing bubble. But I think much more damning because because unambiguous, there's no way for him to weasel out of it, is in 2001, repeatedly he says, what we need right now are lower interest rates to spur housing. Well, that's exactly the problem, right? That's it right there. So that, in a normal society, that would be it. Krugman, he would be finished. He would be finished. But writing for the New York Times means never having to say you're sorry when you're wrong, because if you weren't wrong, you wouldn't be writing for the New York Times in the first place. One other experience I want to make sure I recount here is that a few weeks ago I was in Las Vegas, and while I was there, the host of a PBS program based out of Dallas, but that is syndicated to some other PBS stations, wanted to have me on his little sort of interview program, half-hour interview program. His name is Dennis McQuistion. I love that name. I don't know really why, but it's like Jim Caviezel and Dennis McQuistion are like my two favorite names in the world. Well, anyway, he's got this program, and it's called McQuistion, like the McQuistion program or something. So anyway, he's a fantastic interviewer. He's been doing this for like 20 years, and he's very free market. I mean, in fact, I had to ask him. I don't even remember what his answer was when I asked him how are you staying on the air on PBS? I don't get this. But anyway, very good interviewer. So I was taken by car to a PBS station down the street in Vegas. They're going to record it, and then they're going to air these programs in September. So the stage is set up this way. You got McQuistion here, and you got two chairs over here for two guests. And so the first program, I was the guest along with Steve Forbes as the other guest. And I thought to myself, I'm going to make Forbes look like Barack Obama. I don't know if they're prepared for this, right? But actually, and I have to say, Forbes could not, he could not have been a sweeter human being. Very generous, obviously looking for, because he can't agree with me completely. He doesn't want to get rid of the Fed entirely. But looking for things to compliment me on and talking about the 1920-21 depression. Very, very kind and generous. And then during the program, we were basically talking about things we agreed on. So it actually worked out quite well, and I was very favorably inclined toward him until I left and realized that his new book features a foreword by Rudy Giuliani. Oh, Steve, what are you doing to us, man? I was this close. Oh, man. But anyway, very interesting, however, next to that, is that the second program I did with a guy named Doug Casey. Now, some of you guys may know him as an investor, and he writes newsletters, and he wrote a book on crisis investing that, according to Wikipedia anyway, is the best-selling investment book of all time. So he was there, we did a program together, and here's the amazing thing. Now, I understand not everybody here is necessarily 100% Rothbardian. That's okay. We're very big tent here, very open-minded, not quite to the Giuliani extent, let's say. But all the same, I still want to say this anyway. The subject of this program, what McChristian wanted to talk about this subject, is limited government a myth? And his argument was, he was saying, is it reasonable to expect that if an institution has a monopoly on force and the power of taxation, that it could stay limited to the few functions that are given to it? And I thought, wow, he wants to talk about this on PBS, no less? There's got to be. So he figured, because he knows Casey's a big anarchist, so he figures I'll be the counterpoint. So 30 minutes in, he realizes this isn't quite what. So for 30 minutes, Casey and I are trying to out-radical each other to see what outrageous things we can say. And by the end of the program, we just thought, I don't believe what just happened here. And I got the sense, by the way, again, not to toot my own horn, but I got the sense Casey is not easily impressed. But after this thing, because it was just like a synergy thing and momentum and going, he turned and said, wow, you're good. And I said, so are you. I was just trying to keep up with you. So anyway, when this thing comes out, McChristian says we have permission to put it on YouTube. And so I'll see if how Chad feels about doing that for us, but I just can't believe I participated in that. It was an unbelievable thing. So anyway, I've been doing a lot of public speaking around the country, universities, private firms, whatever. But my favorite appearance so far was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Now, speaking of Boulder, I think I'm like the last guy on earth to know that Boulder is kind of a left-wing campus. This is kind of like not knowing that Berkeley is a left-wing campus, but I didn't know that till I got there. People are saying, oh, you better watch out. What? Innocently what? I don't know what you're talking about. But the funny thing was, we go in there, and here it is, it's a Friday night. This was the night before the Mises Circle in Colorado Springs. So Heather and I drove up to Boulder, and it's a Friday night because the Mises Circle's on a Saturday. This is the only time I could have done it. So here they've advertised for an economics lecture on Friday night in Boulder. I thought, this is a disaster waiting to happen. And the organizers are saying, and we got a hall that holds 250 people. I thought, what's the matter with you people? It'd be like 7 people. It's going to be a disaster. The place was filled. These guys worked so hard to bring people in. So then I thought, okay, yeah, it's filled. It's filled with people with, if they believed in carrying weapons, they would be, but they don't, so they're not. But all the same, they had a few students speak before me, and one of them was sort of taking an informal poll of people's political preferences, which I felt uncomfortable with that. I thought, leave people alone, don't make them identify themselves. But at least a dozen people identified themselves as being supporters of Obama. Well, wasn't that interesting? I thought, they're really going to grill me with questions afterward. So I went and gave the talk, and I think it went well, and I tried to be as funny and charming as possible, which is anytime I'm in the presence of somebody I think isn't going to like me, I try to be funnier than usual and nicer than usual, so that they walk away saying, I don't know what just happened there, but this guy seems okay. So I've just let you in on my trick, by the way. That's my trick. So anyway, and by the way, if I'm being super nice to you, don't think, I think he thinks I hate him. It's not that. So anyway, I was super nice, and I'm making jokes, and then I made a disparaging reference to John McCain, and then I made fun of myself for that, saying, boy, it sure took a lot of courage to stand up here in Boulder and denounce John McCain, right? But anyway, so I went through the whole thing, and at the end, I took a lot of very intelligent questions, but not one person, not one of those people went up to say anything hostile or ask me a challenging question, which would have been fine, and that's what I'm there for. I didn't quite know what to make of that, and then the next day I got an email from somebody who said, I'm an Obama supporter, and I figured I was just going to hate everything you had to say, but it seemed to make sense, and you were very likable and self-deprecating, whatever. What should I read to understand this further? What should you read? Well, so I referred him, and thank goodness we've got these books online and in audio format. So what has government done to our money? Because he wanted to know, because he said, it's not enough to just say the Fed is crummy. He said, I think he's right. He said, you should have said, why was the Fed, at least what was the stated rationale for the Fed in the first place? And then you can explain why it hasn't lived up to that, or why that's a phony rationale. So then I did answer that, and I gave him some stuff about the Fed. But so this has been good, that I have run into people who are open-minded, willing to listen, because I think they have an inchoate understanding that the people who pose as experts are as clueless or more so, than anyone else. So they're willing to entertain different points of view. And in fact, at Boulder, one of the people in the audience was a local newspaper columnist who I understand has made disparaging references to the Austrian school. And I thought he would ask me a question. He didn't. But I did make reference in my talk to this, not to his presence, but I said, the easiest thing in the world is to make fun of the Austrian school. Hey, it's a fringe school, there aren't that many economists who subscribe to it. And I said, because, that's exactly what we need right now, is a popularity contest, right? because the mainstream of economics has done just a bang-up job right now. We couldn't even conceive of listening to anybody else. Oh, no. No way, citizen. Listen to your overlords. And then I think at that point he didn't dare say anything. I told the story before, but the guy who did the audio book, and sometimes people who do audiobooks, you would think they would have great voices and be interesting to listen to, but some of you who listen to audiobooks, you know what I mean. Some of these people, it's like, let's hire the most drone-sounding person on earth to do it is just a soporific, really. But this guy is really super. Really great voice. And he's a guy who's done a lot of radio ads, and so he's just got that right. That almost like the voice of that guy who died recently, who did the movie previews. Like that guy, wow, just perfect voice. So he did the thing, and he had just done the audiobook for Chuck Norris's new book. Now, this audio guy is an Obama supporter, so you can imagine how he felt about Chuck Norris's book. Well, my book is published by the same publisher as Chuck Norris's book, so he got Meltdown. He thought, oh, good grief. I'm earning my money with this. I got to go through another piece of propaganda. But he was, again, very gracious, wrote me an email and said, I have to say, you make a very strong case. Is there any chance that our leaders are going to listen to the Austrians, whatever? So, it was just out of the blue. Like, he didn't have to do that. So it's been very encouraging for me to run into people who are gracious and treat you like a human being. Because oftentimes, especially on the internet, your opponents, it's like you're not even a piece of garbage, the way they treat you, like not even a person. So this has been very encouraging. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been attacked as much as I would like. And it's not because I'm a masochist, I just, please attack me. It's that, being attacked helps to elucidate your position. And also it gets more attention for the book if people are attacking it. Nothing would make me happier than to see Paul Krugman attack it, right? I want that. But the New York Times, according to my publisher, announced that they have no intention to review it. They're not going to review it. Now, I don't know anything about this process. I don't know if it's a common thing that a book is 10 weeks on the list and they're not going to review it. For all I know, that happens all the time. Maybe not. I don't know. But they're not going to review it. So that's okay. That's fine. I'll live with it. But I did get one little bit of a sort of sideswipe attack by a guy named Matthew Iglesias, who is I think he's a 2003 Harvard grad with a degree in psychology. Now, I'm a Harvard grad too, but I hope I'm exempt from this vice that a lot of Harvard grads have, which is you feel like you're an expert on everything because, hey, I went to Harvard. I can speak about everything I've never read a book about, but I can just blah, blah, blah. So Iglesias writes, and this is how the progressive blogosphere is. He's got a Harvard degree, and he can write some snarky commentary. Let's sign him up. But what does he actually know about what he's saying, right? So he writes this post about Austrian business cycle theory, which he doesn't know a blessed thing about, right? I mean, nothing whatsoever. However, he's sure that it's wrong because, hey, look, I found this article by Brian Kaplan, a guy I wouldn't cite under any other conditions, but just this one. And, and I found this other article by Tyler Cowen. Again, a guy I would kind of hate, though not as much as Brian Kaplan. So this was it. And no acknowledgement that both of these articles have been replied to repeatedly or that there could be a reply. So anyway, in the context of this attack, what he was really doing was going after me. And he was saying that, in fact, let me give you the quotation. Woods is pushing a fringe economic doctrine that tells the right what it wants to hear, so he's gaining popularity. Yeah, because all through the 1980s, and what did we hear but down with the Fed, from all the Republican politicians, right? I mean, you just couldn't escape it, right? Fed this, Fed that, all the time. It's just what the right wants to hear. And then Newt Gingrich, right? He never shuts up about how much he wants to abolish the Fed. I mean, what the heck is the guy talking about? What universe are you in? Right? I mean, maybe we switched universes. I don't know what he's talking about. So what the right wants to hear. Well, so I made a challenge to him. How many supposedly, right-wing politicians can you mention to me who have been talking about the Fed stinks, it causes business cycle? I mean, politicians now. How many of them? Well, you just hear crickets. Yeah, I mean, it's Ron Paul. We all, we know that. So, but then, no, so he quotes, so again, he's saying that this is a fringe economic doctrine and, people don't believe it and ha ha ha. And so again, so my reply, I actually wrote a reply to this, and the reply was called, question authority unless I tell you not to. Because his view seems to be that, the Fed is there for the common good and the Fed chairman is just there to try to smooth out business cycles for us and, what kind of a crank would want to question this and so on and so forth. And so, my sort of thinking on this is I'm really disappointed in the left. And I know you think, well, why would you expect anything better? But during the Bush years, some people on the left seemed kind of okay to me, because they actually seemed like they questioned things. They didn't just accept a Pentagon press release at face value. They actually asked questions. They wanted to know about, well, can you imprison somebody forever, with no charges, whatever. I mean, they asked questions about these things. They were asking good questions. Whereas I felt like the so-called right wing was just the worst bunch of shills for the regime you could imagine. So it was hard not to have at least a glimmer of sympathy for these people. So I thought, well, you know what? Maybe they'll be just as hard on Obama as they were on that other guy. And it's not really the case. Now, I know you can point to Glenn Greenwald. There are some good people. I acknowledge that. And I'll also point out that I don't just talk about wanting to be generous to anybody who at least sees the folly of certain, of the empire. I did this collection of anti-war writings with a guy named Murray Polner, who's way on the left, but we came to the opinion that, we're both against mass murder, and that's a good start for a friendship. So we put together, I think, a really interesting, ideologically diverse collection. I mean, how many anti-war collections are going to have, Howard Zinn, but also Murray Rothbard? Right? I mean, like never. It just wouldn't happen. But it happened, and so I'm happy about that. So having said that, now I can go and trash the left. Again, I know there are honorable exceptions. You don't need to point that out. But I remember watching Ron Paul on MSNBC or CNBC, and he was talking about abolishing the Fed. Which, I mean, this has not been even slightly on the table, and he's sitting there with a big old grin on his face talking about, we just got to get rid of this thing. And there's this young kid, sort of left liberal kid up there going, yeah, but you'd just be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So I thought, isn't this funny? So here we have the question authority kid immediately running to the defense of established institutions. First instinct, there's an established institution under attack, I must defend. What happened to question authority? So at that point, I thought to myself, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I thought, well, if I'm ever asked that, the jerk store, right? And then George Costanza, jerk store was the line. I thought to myself, I think I have a line for this. So sure enough, I was on a radio show in Ohio, and the host said, I agree with what you're saying, but it sounds a little extreme. Don't you think abolishing the Fed, you'd be throwing out the baby with the bathwater? And I said, you want to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it's a demon baby. So I got to use it. Oh, it's a dream come true. Oh, it's just a meatball right over the plate. Oh, beautiful. But anyway, so we got question authority people, but it turns out when they say question authority, they mean question authority except the Treasury Secretary, the Fed Chairman, the SEC, the medical establishment, the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, the Washington Post, and the officially approved version of American history you learned in 4th grade. Other than that, go ahead and ask. Now, another little run-in I had wasn't direct, but some of you may know a radio host named Tom Hartman. Hartman, if you haven't heard of him, he's actually quite interesting. He's led a very interesting life. But when one of the major news magazines made a list of the top 10 most listened to or most influential radio talk show hosts, he was the only one on the left in the list. So the rest of them were all the usual blowhards we know about, and then Tom Hartman. So Hartman had this article on the Huffington Post months ago in which he went through the list of the economists whose ideas are responsible for the economic crisis. Let me read them to you. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, all right, well, Tom Friedman, Robert Rubin, Larry Summers. You mean Mr. Pro-Stimulus Larry Summers is just like Ludwig von Mises? And Ayn Rand, of course. Now let's leave aside that... That really tickled Roderick, that one right there. Now let's leave aside the fact that he's got it's bad enough, misspellings, they happen, right? I once had a student who on the title page of his paper misspelled his own name. That is not a joke. Well, this guy, now, he's writing an article about the economic crisis and he's about these economists. You'd think he'd read them before, you don't condemn something without reading it, right? So, in spite of all the Hayek books on his nightstand next to his bed, he still makes 2 spelling errors in Hayek's name. 2! In one name! So I thought, well, maybe he's just not reading that closely. I don't know. So, and then I heard that recently he was talking on the air and somebody had to correct him and say, no, actually, Mises died in 1973. He thought Mises was actually still alive, walking around causing business cycles. So I wrote a response to Hartman, and the article is called "Don't Know Much About Capitalism." And I went through, I listed all these, and I thought, I'm thinking he got this list of free market economists by just Googling market and economists and just sort of doing a little estimate of who were the most popular names. And they're all basically probably close enough that we can just say Mises equals Hayek equals Larry Summers equals Tom Friedman. So then he gets to, now he talks about, because obviously this is all caused by deregulation and all that. So then he gets to the savings and loan thing. Now this is a little bit before a lot of your time here, but he's talking about in the 1980s, the savings and loan institutions went belly up and there were bailouts and everything else. And he was saying that, and I hate to come right out with it. I want to build up the suspense. Like, what do you think Tom Hartman would attribute the problems of the SNLs to? I mean, let's just think of what possible answer he might give. It was deregulation. What did you say? Lysander Spooner? That's a good runner-up. No, deregulation. It was deregulation. I mean, how would he ever have thought of that, right? Deregulation. I was so shocked that was his explanation. Well, what actually happened with the SNLs, to make a long story really short, I told this to somebody earlier at lunch, was this, that the savings and loan institutions were created and then husbanded by the U.S. government. And the idea is they're going to make mortgage loans. They're going to make 30-year fixed-rate mortgage loans at 6%, and they're going to offer 3% to depositors. And then, that's going to be their business model, in effect. Well, by the late 1970s, the problem was that people were putting their money in money market accounts that were paying a better return than the crummy 3% at the SNLs. So people were pulling their money out of the SNLs. So the SNLs were starting to argue, Well, number one, we're going to have to be able to pay more to depositors if we're going to stay afloat. And secondly, we need to be able to make other kinds of loans in order to have a chance to bring in more dough. And so, so-called deregulation consisted of allowing them to make higher payments to depositors and allowing them to diversify into other kinds of loans. So notice, it is the fault of the free market when a government-established institution has its government-established rules changed, while all the while its deposits are insured by the government. That's the free market's fault, according to Tom Hartman. But that's the usual thing. Now, maybe the S&Ls did have an unsustainable business model, but there's no way to know under these circumstances. It's shot through with regulations. And this is why the whole deregulation question so misses the point, because typically a lot of this deregulation so-called activity would make sense under a 100% reserve gold standard, but would not make sense under this situation. Because simply to say to banks, you can do riskier things, but then all the while we're going to continue to insure your deposits, well, this is obviously some kind of phony deregulation, which is usually what most deregulation is. It's always phony. Half the time it makes the situation worse than before, so people can say, deregulation. I want to quote for you, I didn't get a copy of it, so I'm going to just pretend I'm holding it up. Guido Hulsmann has a book that, if you people haven't read it, shame on you. Well, I'll give you like another 2 months, and then retroactively I'll go back and give you the shame. Guido has this book called The Ethics of Money Production that is so good and important. If you've read What Has Government Done to Our Money, then the next thing, you're thinking to yourself, I've read What Has Government Done to Our Money, but man, that book by DeSoto, Money, Bank, Credit, and Economic Cycles, looks way too big. Then the great intermediate point is The Ethics of Money Production. Absolutely fantastic, unbelievable book. All right, great. And Guido also makes this point that regulation, deregulation is by and large beside the point half the time. Guido writes this. He says, the banks must keep certain minimum amounts of equity. Here we go. There it is. The banks must keep certain minimum amounts of equity and reserves. They must observe a great number of rules in granting credit. Their executives must have certain qualifications, and so on. Yet these stipulations trim the branches without attacking the root. They seek to curb certain known excesses that spring from moral hazard, but they do not eradicate moral hazard itself. As we have seen, moral hazard is implied in the very existence of paper money. Because a paper money producer can bail out virtually anybody, the citizens become reckless in their speculations. They count on him to bail them out, especially when many other people do the same thing. To fight such behavior effectively, one must abolish paper money. Regulations merely drive the reckless behavior into new channels. And then finally, one might advocate the pragmatic stance of fighting moral hazard on an ad hoc basis wherever it shows up. Thus, one would regulate one industry after another until the entire economy is caught up in a web of micro-regulations. This would, of course, provide some sort of order, but it would be the order of a cemetery. Nobody could make any potentially reckless investment decisions anymore. Everything would have to follow rules set up by the legislature. In short, the only way to fight moral hazard without destroying its source, fiat inflation, is to subject the economy to a Soviet-style central plan. Wow. Good stuff. Right in here, baby. Yeah, there he is. Right in here. Okay. All right, well, Bob only went 45 minutes last night, so I'm just going to do just a few more minutes, or just a few more things I want to say. I think because of the notoriety that the book got, this is one of the reasons I was invited a few weeks ago to be in a debate in Las Vegas about whether or not we should abolish the Fed. And I thought, even if I stink up the place, the very fact that this subject is being debated and then televised on C-SPAN 2 is a good thing. So I put it, I've actually linked to this debate on, I have a website, tomwoods.com, on the media page, there's a link to it. And so it's 2-on-2. It's Gene Epstein from Barron's, a great financial publication, and me, against John Fund of the Wall Street Journal and Warren Coates. Now, if you don't know Warren Coates, he's formerly of the IMF. He's a former Fed economist. He is, what's the other thing? Oh, he's helped to establish central banks in the former Yugoslavia. So, talk about concentrating in what you're worst in, right? So, anyway, so we go have this debate, and I think it went pretty well for our side. But the interesting thing is, as Bob pointed out, was we start off, everybody's got to give an opening statement. So I go up there, and I give, and normally I don't read off a paper. I hate doing that. But this time I figured I've only got 5 minutes. I have a lot of arguments to make against the Fed. I want to make sure I get to them all. So I got up there. But it was a relatively rip-roaring opening statement. Then Coates gets up, and I thought, okay, look, this guy's the world's foremost expert. He could probably rip my head off. We'll just have to see. And he got up there and he said, look, I'm going to concede, central banks have a terrible track record. They've made all these mistakes. They've had this, that problem, that problem. Then he runs out of time. So I thought, well, this is going to be a little easier than I thought. So then Gene Epstein gets up there, and I kind of figured, okay, Gene Epstein, I've read his articles, he's a great guy, but he is, after all, with a mainstream financial publication, so I'll probably have to be a little more radical than this guy. That's okay, I'll have to deal with it, but it's fine. This guy he gets up there, gives this fantastic extemporaneous opening statement, in which he starts off by saying, that it all comes down to the type of society you want to live in. The Fed makes possible all the worst aspects of the empire, the wars, and he goes on and on. He says, take, for example, the War of 1812. That couldn't have happened without central banking. And without, on and on. So he picks, this is beautiful. He picks like one of the least offensive wars in American history and points to that as, this just shows central banking is terrible. So it was great. And then he says, and by the way, notice I haven't even mentioned economics yet. This is all just about freedom. He said, but I will mention economics, and I will say the Fed causes business cycle. This is unbelievable. We win. We should just go. That's amazing. Gene Epstein is unbelievable. So anyway, it was a great, great event, although I did have Warren Coates tell me, and believe me, I'm not making this up. You can just watch it for yourselves. He said, first of all, anyone is free not only to contract in gold, but to require people to pay him in gold, and can in fact refuse the U.S. dollar. And secondly, interest rates are set by the free market. So the Fed doesn't set interest rates, which of course is in a very, very technical sense correct, but as Bob pointed out about other things, almost certainly designed to mislead. So we did correct him on that. But what reason I mention this is my experience there, given that everybody in that room was on our side. Everybody in the audience was on our side. There's no question about it. So the default position, and I realize that you don't have to be a libertarian to be an Austrian and vice versa, but well, I don't know, maybe not vice versa, but you don't have to be a libertarian, strictly speaking, to be an Austrian. Nevertheless, I will say something about libertarians. It seems like the default position among libertarians now is anti-Fed. Whereas I think before, you could be this, you could be that. But it's like there has been a sea change. I mean, maybe it's Ron Paul. I think that's a good chunk of it. But everybody just assumes, like people were saying to me, oh, you're going to have a breeze of it because everyone's going to be on your side. Who at this whole event would possibly be for the Fed? So this has really, really changed. This is not relevant, but I want to mention anyway as one of my last points. My wife sent me a video a few weeks ago, and it's a video of some of you probably saw this, the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve being questioned about, what do you know about this or that, and she doesn't even seem to understand the question. And it was just a stunning video. And so, first of all, it reminded me that this is a message for the gentleman. If you meet a woman who digs up anti-Fed videos and sends them to you, you should marry her. But here's the interesting thing. If you go to the page of the Office of the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve, which is federalreserve.gov/OIG, you read this description of what the Inspector General does. The Office of Inspector General conducts independent and objective audits, inspections, evaluations, investigations, and other reviews related to programs and operations of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. OIG efforts promote, and when I tell you what the OIG efforts promote, just think to yourself, yes, Federal Reserve. Integrity, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Help prevent and detect fraud. And strengthen the accountability to the Congress and the public. The OIG's work assists the board in managing risk and achieving its overall mission to, again, think Fed, foster the stability, integrity, and efficiency of the nation's monetary, financial, and payment systems so as to promote optimal macroeconomic performance. Well, you have to give them credit for having a sense of humor at the Fed because, and not just because of that statement, but if you go to that page, there is a link you can click on, I am not joking, to report fraud, waste, and abuse at the Federal Reserve. All right. Well, having said that, nothing I have to say could possibly top that. So thank you all very much.